In the heart of the woods walked a scarred guardian, feared by all, until one girl dared to see him, and he saw her. A monster, some spat, drawing doors shut against the night. A curse, others muttered, dropping a sprig of rowan on their thresholds. No one agreed what he looked like. They agreed only on the lesson. Do not wander. Do not look too long into the shadows. Do not give the trees a reason to notice your name. The girl who carried the basket of herbs had heard all this since she was small. She heard it now too, as she passed the well and kept her eyes on the ground while women drew water and men exchanged news. Her relatives spoke of her as if she were a loose stitch they had to keep tucking in. Plain, they called her. Odd, a charity they'd accepted out of duty and never let her forget. She slipped away from the square as the sun thinned across the fields. The houses hunched behind her. The world went softer and greener ahead. She stepped beneath the first branches and breathed, really breathed, until the tightness beneath her ribs eased. Mint announced itself with a sharp sweetness along the bank. Feverfew clustered like little suns near a fallen log. Yarrow lifted its tiny banners in the tall grass. She moved among them as if among old friends, humming to keep her hands steady while she clipped stems and coaxed stubborn roots loose. Earth lodged beneath her nails. Dew kissed her skirts. A wren scolded her from a tangle of nettles, and then decided, after all, to hop closer and tilt its head. The forest answered her in small ways. The hush of a fern when she brushed it. The way the light filtered in a green-gold sieve through the leaves. Even the brook seemed to tilt its bright face toward her, as if to say there was time enough for gentleness. Then the air changed. Not a wind, not a scent, a stillness. The wren swallowed its song. The brook held its breath. The light, somehow, leaned back and watched. Her hand stalled over a sprig of feverfew. She knew that stillness, old stories had taught it to her body, if not to her mind. Every part of her understood that turning would be a choice. She turned. At first, she thought the oak behind the clearing had grown a second trunk overnight. Then the trunk moved. He stepped out of shadows the way an old truth steps out from behind a lie, slowly, inevitably. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, a silhouette made of bark and storm. His skin held the roughness of old wood, but in the long scars carved across chest and arms, something like amber burned faintly, pulsing with a sap-lit glow. Moss clung to him as if it trusted no other place. From his skull, 2 antlers rose and broke, shattered some time long ago and never mended. His hair tangled with twigs and leaves, his eyes were the color of a storm seen through a canopy of green. The stories had not warned her that fear could be quiet. It could arrive, fold itself neatly inside her lungs, and sit there like a guest who brought nothing but took everything in sight. She looked at him. He looked at her. She understood that if she ran, the forest would watch her run. If she screamed, it would remember the note forever. "Careful," she said, because her mouth, traitor to the rest of her, had decided on an ordinary sentence. "You'll scare the rabbits." His eyes, bright with their strange light, blinked once. The sound that came from him when he spoke was like a boulder shifting deeper in the hill. "You see me." "You're standing in plain sight," she said, and surprised herself by sounding almost annoyed. "It would be ruder to pretend I didn't." He did not come closer. He did not go. The forest leaned in again, just slightly, as if it had been promised a story. She turned back to the feverfew. Her hands remembered how to move. She cut 3 stems, then 4. She was aware of his gaze, the way one is aware of a mountain, always there no matter where one stands. When she rose at last, the basket heavy against her hip, he remained where he had stepped into the clearing. The air around him felt old and solemn and patient. "Whatever you are," she said, and lifted the basket to show she had nothing else to offer. "I won't harm what lives here." Something passed through his face then. if a face of bark and scar could learn to show a passing thing. Not quite relief, not quite disbelief. He shifted one step back into shadow so that only the faint amber of scar light and the pale ruin of his antlers held the dusk. She left the clearing by the path she used when deer took the main one. The forest did not tug at her skirt. The brook found its song again. Above her, a rook scribbled itself across the paling sky. She did not look back. She felt looked after, and that was almost the same. The village liked to tell wicked stories around a good stew. That night the stew was thin and the story thicker. The aunt tutted and tapped the spoon against the pot and said a girl who didn't learn to keep her eyes down would end with no husband and no bread. The cousins, who had not learned the difference between cleverness and cruelty, laughed in relief that neither could be aimed at them. She took the bowl they gave and ate the broth and left the onions. The house smelled of soap and smoke and a low, steady disappointment. When the bowl was empty, she washed it, put it in the place where bowls lived, and listened to the walls. They always had a little something to say. "She spends more time in the woods than in prayer," the aunt muttered beyond the thin wood of the sleeping room. "If she comes home with a curse, we could have said we told her at least." "She thinks weeds make her special," one cousin said, as if any fool can't pull a plant from dirt. "Plain," the other said, and there was something hungry in the word, as if it fed her to say it. The girl lay down on the cot that was hers because no one else wanted it, and let her eyes find the line the moon wrote across the ceiling. The moon had the good grace not to say anything at all. In the morning, she carried the basket and the knife and a small cloth of bread and stepped into the green. He was there, not always so close. Sometimes he stood 10 paces off and looked like a fallen tree considering whether to rise. Sometimes a flicker at the corner of her sight, and when she glanced, nothing but moss and light. Today he waited beside the brook. The brook, which had opinions, refused to look impressed. "Will you keep watching me?" she asked, "or will you say what you want?" Time is a different animal in an old place. He used all of it before he answered. "Why do you not fear me?" "Fear?" She tugged up a strand of mint and smiled when it released the soil without complaint. "Should I? All men do." The voice was not proud or self-pitying. It simply carried its own long weather. Even mine. She set the mint in the basket and looked at him the way she looked at a plant whose name she'd not yet learned. "Then perhaps I am not like them." The brook decided this was almost witty and allowed itself a brighter note. On a different morning, a thorn found the soft inside of her palm. The hurt was sharp enough to bring tears like sudden rain. She took a breath to steady her hands, but the breath was unsteady and the world wobbled at the edges. His hand, if the word hand could be stretched to hold something so large, so rough, moved before thought could catch it. Bark-rough skin cradled her smaller palm. The glow in his scars gathered itself, pooled, and ran in a thin warmth over the cut. The sting dimmed, then stilled. She looked at their joined hands. The forest looked too. "You've carried pain a long time," she said, without thinking to make it a question. He did not answer. The light in his cracks receded like a tide. He withdrew his hand as if he had trespassed. After that, the forest began to set the table for them. A stump that made exactly the right seat beside a patch of thyme. Wild strawberries in a place they had not grown last spring. A hollow between roots, deep enough to hide the basket when rain came hard. He did not become smaller for her. He did not try to braid his strangeness into something a village might recognize. He came as a storm comes, with a sky that darkens and a wind that makes the poplars sound like a crowd. She did not become louder for him. She did not perform bravery she did not feel. She became more like herself where the world could see it. When she asked about the old days, how old were they, these days he spoke of, and how had they slipped away, he turned his face to the canopy and let his voice move the air. "Once your kind brought bowls of honey and the first cut of bread and laid them where paths cross. They spoke to roots as if to elders and drank river water as if to teachers. They gave thanks. We gave protection. The balance was a song, and we all remembered the tune. And then? Fire came, he said. Iron came. Men forgot. The word men might have meant only the sort who make forgetting into a weapon. She chose to hear it that way. Not all have forgotten, she said, and ran her fingers across the time so it would release its scent in agreement. He looked at her as if she were a thing he had once known and had mislaid. For a heartbeat, the light in his scars deepened to a warmer gold. Then it was gone, and the forest pretended not to have seen. The village noticed in its inefficient way. It noticed when a girl did not marry. It noticed when fields bore too little and blamed the nearest thing with hands. It noticed when someone brought something home that looked more like joy than bread. Her aunt's voice shortened like a hem cut badly. Her cousins picked at her silence as if it were a scab they were determined to make bleed. At the well, the other women pressed their lips together when she came near. The men, who preferred their stories with clear villains, supplied one and watched her for signs of contamination. She did not stop going to the forest. The forest did not stop meeting her at the edge. On a dusk soft with the smell of rain, 2 dogs followed at a distance. She turned twice. They turned too. When she knelt to tie her shoe, they pretended to find something interesting in a ditch. When she unknotted her apron to free a caught thread, they lowered their noses to the path in a pantomime of useful work. They were not her cousin's dogs. They belonged to the men who enjoyed hunting best when the thing hunted ran on 2 legs. She walked with the particular ease of a person who understood being watched. The path to the ash tree wound to the right. She took the left along the stream, where the ground was wetter and her footprints would dissolve. The dogs, not knowing the etiquette of riverbanks, splashed ahead and made a nonsense of the men's slow prowling behind. He was there before she reached the roots. The ash rose like a history lesson, all rings and reach and patient shade. He stood beside it as if he had grown there. "They are following," he said, not as a warning but as a fact that had to stand next to other facts, like moss grows on the north side and some nights the owls come early. She placed the basket within the cradle the roots made and let her shoulders relax for the first time since the path. "I know." He moved closer by an inch that contained a mile. "You come even so." "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said, and flinched at how raw it sounded once it was outside her. He made a sound then, softer than a word, somewhere between a sigh and the sound trunks make when snow settles heavy. It belonged to a time before language had collected itself into names. She had the sense he wanted to say, "I will be the place you can be," but was not sure the forest would allow a promise that large. When the first man came into the clearing, he came with his courage already used up. It was always the way, bravery spent ahead of time in the telling, not left for the moment one needed it. He had a bow. His hands shook. The second man had eyes like nails, hammered half into wood and left there to rust. The third had a mouth already shaped to triumph. They saw what they had come to see. A girl with a basket, a monster with antlers of ruin, and a body like a storm, the shadow of an old story and the shape of a new wound they meant to make. The arrow loosed off the third man's string without anyone quite telling it to. It sang a thin song. She saw the line it drew in the air and understood, in the small, calm corner of herself where fear could not reach, that she would not move quickly enough. He moved for her. He did not roar. He did not crush. He simply set his body between the arrow and her. The shaft met his shoulder with a sound like a stick snapped over a knee. The amber light beneath his skin flared and ran from the wound as if a tree had learned to bleed. "No," she said, and the word came out a prayer and a curse together. She pressed her palms to the place where the shaft had struck. The heat beneath her hands was not fire, it was summer gathered into one point. The men had not expected the quiet of this. They expected screaming and blood like theirs. The guardian's stillness unnerved the narrative. The first man dropped his bow as if it had insulted him. The second pulled the third backward by his sleeve. The dogs, who knew a mistake when they smelled one, turned and ran before their masters did. He stood without moving until the forest agreed the danger had retreated. Only then did he look down at her hands and then at her face. "You protected me," she said, and tasted the strangeness of being worth a wound. "You did not run," he said, as if that were the larger miracle. She laughed, and the laugh hurt. "Perhaps I am not like them." The amber steadied. The broken antlers cast small shadows across her wrists. She found she was shaking and let it happen. He was not made for human consolations. He was made for weathering. He did what he knew. He weathered with her until the shaking was done. When she could speak again, the words came with no ceremony at all. They were hand-sized words, meant to be held and kept. "I would stay," she said. "I would care for you as I do the plants, as I would for anyone I—" She swallowed. The forest bent close, listener and witness. "Anyone I love." The light inside him answered before his mouth could. It rose, deepened, made a candle of every scar. He bowed his head, not in worship, not in fear, but in the awkward astonishment of being chosen. The ash tree shifted in a wind that had not arrived yet. Somewhere up the slope, a fox uncurled and decided the night would be gentle after all. The days that followed put down roots. The wound closed under her touch and his strange, slow heat. He showed her the deep well where cool water slept, and the hollow oak whose heart had rotted out to make a room for squirrels and secrets. She showed him how to wrap a sprain with comfrey leaves so the swelling would not boss the body so loudly, and how lavender coaxed sleep even from a mind that chased itself. He did not sleep as humans did. He sank into a standing stillness, and the moss on his shoulders grew a fraction, and the owls landed closer than they would have if he had been a tree. But on a night when the moon hung low and easy, he lowered himself at the base of the ash and leaned his back against the bark and let his head tip to one side. She slept 3 paces away. If the forest saw 2 beings who had made a habit of solitude keeping watch over each other's unguarded hours, it decided to mind its own business. The village had opinions about all this without knowing a thing. The ant hissed words like duty and shame and neighbor, as if reciting them in any order would build a wall the girl could not pass through. The cousins sharpened their tongues against her quiet. One afternoon, a man with tidy shoes and a voice that wore ribbons came to the door under the pretense of borrowing a tool and left with the satisfaction of a name he could take back to the men who liked to make a problem of a girl and a wood. The girl tied up her few things in a cloth before dawn the next day and set them in the corner near the door. She stood there a moment, putting away what could not be tied, the small cleannesses of home, the way sunlight glazed the table in late afternoon, the smell of bread, even when the bread was not hers. She let herself take them, because leaving without taking anything would be a smaller lie and a deeper cruelty. At the forest edge, the day was new enough to still be dew. He waited among beech trunks, tall as if the ground needed reminding where up was. "You came," he said, and then seemed to realize how foolish a thing that was, to say to a person who had walked her feet here. "You come," he corrected, and the forest decided that was fair. They walked without a destination in the ordinary sense. He knew a place where stone made a wall that kept off the worst winds, and where a spring slid from the hill with the patience of a story that can afford to take its time. There, a hollow beneath interlacing roots could be convinced to become a room if one gave it a door of woven branches and a floor of dry needles and fern. They made it together, not out of haste or fear, but out of the pleasure of building a thing that would hold a breathing being safely inside it. When night came, she lay listening to the spring talk to itself, and to the way his weight changed the sound the ground made. She had never shared a roof with anyone who had not resented the shelter they shared. The roof of root and fern resented no one. She slept. The forest taught them its calendar. Violets wrote themselves in the margins first. then explosions of wild garlic and the sweet clogged air of hawthorn. A week of rain that made everything taste like tin. Heat that flung dragonflies across the water like sparks. Then mushrooms, buttons and antlers and parasols squatting like lords in the moss. They rescued a fawn one morning, its leg caught in a snare the men with tidy shoes like to call a necessity. He held the thin, panicked body still as a sapling in a storm while she cut, whispering nonsense so the fawn would have words to hold. When it bolted at last, his hand closed on nothing, and he let it be nothing. The forest, in its unshowy way, wrote their names a little more legibly at its edge. Sometimes they argued. She wanted to gather near the old stones that held morning sun longer. He preferred the low ground where the fern gave better cover. She wanted to tell a woman at the well that willow bark might ease her husband's constant ache. He wanted to let the village wear the ache it had made. They met in the middle. She left a twist of willow bark in a place the woman would find it and never know who had known her pain. He walked the ridge above the fields and did not flatten the hedge a boy had spent the day mending. On a night when the sky burned with heat lightning that refused rain, he told her the story of his first wound. Not the one men had made with arrows and noise, but the one no one saw. It was a fire from the west, he said, when their kind still stood in a ring around a hill and kept its water from blowing away in summer. The fire ran at them and through them until the ring broke, and some of them learned to become smoke and some learned to become ash, and he, foolish as sap, tried to become both and failed. The scars had glowed since. She listened with her hands on her knees and her eyes on his face and said nothing clever at all. When he had done, she reached out and touched the nearest of those long old burns with 2 fingers as reverently as if it were a relic. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." He looked at the ash tree above them. The ash tree minded its own business, but even trees sometimes wish to nod. Word makes its own weather in a place that prefers plows to prayers. The men who had fled the clearing told a story that did not match their own bones, and because shame is inventive, the story grew teeth and a second tail. The girl had bewitched the creature had bewitched the girl. The creature had carried her off, eaten her, married her, turned her to moss, any ending that let the tellers sit with their fear long enough to rid it of wonder. A winter came that thought itself clever and wore spring's coat for a week. The snow broke and then came back muttering about fickleness. In the baffled middle of it, a child in the village burned with a fever that could not decide whether to stay or go. The girl went at dusk and set a twist of willow and yarrow at the back door where the mother's hand would know it when she reached to draw the bolt. No one saw. She did not need them to. If a kindness is done in the dark keeps it like a secret pearl. Spring arrived properly at last with the riot of birds who had been holding their tongues for too long. The brook grew bossy. The violets established small kingdoms wherever no one would kneel on them. She and he walked the boundary where light and leaf decide which of them owns a patch of air, and the arguments they had now were easy ones. Whether the fox that crossed the path had a mate, whether the owl they could not see was a pair of owls or only a gifted mimic. She threaded a small garland of early cow parsley and hung it on the antler that had broken closest to his head. He stood so still for the hanging you would have thought he had the sculptor's disease. When she stepped back, the white umbels rested against the ruin of old bone and made the scar a thing crowned, not hidden. "Better," she said. He lifted a hand as if to touch the garland, and then, very carefully, did not. "Better," he agreed, and the word gave itself the shape of a smile without making the face attempt one. Summer taught them how to be quiet together without filling the quiet with explanations. She would read the forest. This plant meant damp deeper down. This ant road meant a fallen thing not far off. This knot of flies in a bright place meant something wrong, and he would read her, which is a more difficult language, and know when to make stillness to rest in and when to walk, slowly, until the walking shook the mood loose. One evening, when heat turned the undergrowth into a breath you had to push through, she stopped on the path and pressed her fingers to her temples as if to keep a thought from escaping. He halted at once, the way a horse will when it accepts a rider's smallest ask. "I keep thinking of the words they used," she said, eyes on the ground because the ground told the truth. Plain, burden, odd, as if a mouth saying a thing could make it more real than a life lived. There was a long space between the last word and his answer. He was not slow, he was exacting. "They were wrong," he said. She made a skeptical noise. She only allowed herself away from human ears. "Perhaps, but wrong words have long legs." He considered this, then stepped forward and placed his hand over the crown of her head, the way one tests a loaf for doneness, lightly, and drew the weight down across her hair, as if smoothing the wildness there. "Let them walk," he said at last. "We are rooted." She did not cry at that. She said, "All right," and the forest accepted the bargain. "The people may talk, but we will grow." Autumn found its pockets, coppered everything it could reach, and laid frost delicately over the places it liked best at dawn. They dug, she with a tool, he with the long curve of his fingers, where the ground gave way easily, and showed each other the old bones of stones. She saved seeds, wrapping them in scraps of cloth and labeling them with bits of thread so she'd remember who each wanted to be in spring. He mended a place in the woven door where a squirrel had decided a shortcut would be admirable. At the edge of the fields, men were binding what they had coaxed from the dirt. At the edge of the woods, a girl and something older than men were doing the same work by other means. They were making a life. One morning, a stag stood at the limit of the clearing where the ash kept its counsel. The stag lifted its head, breathed fog, and bowed just enough to be seen doing it. The guardian cocked his own ruined antlers in acknowledgement. The girl, who understood only some ceremonies but understood gratitude a little better every day, bowed to both of them. The stag moved on. The light shifted. The season turned the page. The winter that followed was honest. Snow came when it meant to, and when it left as if embarrassed to have stayed so long. On deep nights when cold rang like a struck bell, he stood in the doorway and made a windbreak of himself while she slept, and the spring spoke a lower language because of his shape. On mornings when frost wrote old runes on the fern, she warmed stones near the coals and wrapped them in cloth and pressed them to the places where wood found his core and refused to let it be cold. If anyone had asked either of them where home was, they would have pointed to a thing not marked on any map. There were, of course, more men. Not the same three. Men are a crop that appears no matter how the field is planted. They came with metal that wanted to be more important than stone, and with fire that called itself clean. He met them where the path narrowed. He did not shout, he did not strike first. He suggested in a voice older than their grandfathers that the balance wished to be remembered. Some men can learn a lesson not aimed at their heads. Those men backed away with their eyes still open. On a day when sun came back, as if it had been gone a century, and was surprised to find everything still standing, she took his hand. She had held it to heal. She had clutched it to save. This was neither. It was simply that two hands existed in the same air and wished not to be separate. He looked down as if at a thing he had almost remembered the word for. The scars lit. He did not move. "See?" she said, as if she had just won a small argument about whether time belonging near the door was a good idea. "Belonging isn't loud." He nodded once. The forest, which preferred understatement, approved. What happened next depends who tells it. A woman at the well said the charity girl had vanished, and it served her aunt right. The cousins said it had been a matter of time. The men told versions of their own story to each other until none of them recognized their parts anymore. The child whose fever had emptied in the night grew and did not thank anyone out loud. The stag wintered and shed and returned in spring to bow precisely no degrees more than necessary. The rook continued to write rude things across the morning, and the forest kept the names it had chosen to keep. One evening the ash tree stood very straight, and the guardian and the girl stood beneath it, and there was a distance between their hands not much larger than the distance between a wish and its answer. He did not ask for vows. She did not offer ones she could not spend. They made a different sort of promise, one the place could believe, to be the other's shelter when weather happened, to teach and to be taught, to heal what could be mended and to hold what could not. The light in his scars softened to a steady glow. The sunlight on her hair made an ordinary halo, the kind that means someone has worked outside. They said the forest did not forget, she murmured, half to him and half to the green world that had learned their footsteps. Perhaps they meant it kindly and the kindness got lost. Perhaps, he said, they will learn to remember. She turned her head to look up at him, this difficult, unlikely being who had not asked to be more than the sum of his wounds and yet was. He looked down at her, this plain, ordinary, astonishing girl who had decided to treat him as one treats a storm, with respect, with patience, with the understanding that there is beauty in weather. Their fingers touched. The ash made the smallest sound, something like a satisfied breath. The brook wrote a brighter sentence and carried it away to tell the lower fields. If anyone in the village asked, the forest had no statement to release. It had a story, though, and it told it with violets and frost, with birds that came and went, with the way two sets of prints sometimes braided and sometimes parted along the path, and always, always found their way back to the same door of woven branches beneath the old roots. They said the forest never forgot. They were right. It remembered fear, and it remembered hunger, and at last, it remembered kindness. And because memory shapes the place that holds it, the remembering made a clearing warmer, a spring brighter, a shadow less sharp. It also remembered two names, one a girl who knew the uses of willow and thyme and laughter, one a guardian who had long ago lost the tune of a balance and had now unexpectedly found a singer to set him back in key. The forest kept the names the way good earth keeps a seed, covered, protected, sure of what will break open given time. And when wind moved through the canopy at dusk, if you stood very still, you could almost hear it, the small, untheatrical song of belonging, sung in two voices, in a language not spoken at wells, but understood by roots. They said the forest did not forget, and it was true, for in its roots and rivers, in its leaves and stones, two names lingered, the girl with herbs and the scarred guardian of the woods, not curse, not monster, not burden, but beloved. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.